Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Last time I left you off at the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. I just touched on Bleeding Kansas. Going to be a brief overview of it and what really happens during Bleeding Kansas, and John Brown, one man who made a lot of people scared. So what was Bleeding Kansas? If you remember, quick review, you had pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery forces rushing into Kansas to use popular sovereignty to decide the issue of slavery in Kansas. In 1854, that's that Kansas-Nebraska Act, people are flooding there. Remember what I said, there was more pro-slavery forces who arrived to Kansas and allowed their side to win the vote. There was more pro-slavery than anti-slavery people who were rushing into Kansas. Remember, the first government that was set up there was supported by Franklin Pierce, the President of the United States. He only looked at pro-slavery legislature. And remember, for the first couple of years, Kansas was a slave territory. It was considered a slave territory. The South, remember, the South got the Fugitive Slave Act in the Compromise of 1850, so people were wanting slavery in Kansas. Those Southerners, a lot of those Northern abolitionists who would help these slaves would get put to death by that new government. So what we say here is those Whigs that separated, you have between 1854 and 1857 slavery being democratically ran and by the pro-slavery Democrats of the South. So what happens? Why is it Bleeding Kansas? I told you something before. I said, hey, a couple hundred people died. Well, here's the first thing. The first thing is called the Sack of Lawrence. Lawrence, the city of Lawrence, was pretty much the epicenter of the anti-slavery movement in Kansas. Most people in Kansas really wanted Kansas to be admitted as a free state, but because of those outside forces, those outside pro-slavery forces, they get put in charge of Kansas, those slavery Democrats. In 1856, this pro-slavery grand jury charges the anti-slavery government with treason. Now you're going to start having people really start getting and fighting against each other. These pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri go in. They attack the city of Lawrence. That's that location of the anti-slavery leaders. What do they do there? They attack Lawrence. They burn buildings like this one right here, the Free State Hotel. That is a picture that I took of the modern day Free State Hotel. They would stuff ballot boxes in order to sway the vote to an anti-slavery vote. So these border ruffians, they go over there. They don't kill. The border ruffians aren't really killing yet. They're burning the town. They're like the Free State Hotel. They're burning homes. They're attacking homes of anti-slavery forces in Lawrence, Kansas. This is why it's called the Sack of Lawrence. These border ruffians go in there and really take down the city, burn the city down, and cause a lot of havoc, a lot of ruckus. So these anti-slavery forces, they create a new government called the Free Soil Party. I mentioned that last time. 1857, those Northern abolitionist Whigs, they broke off. They created the Republican Party, and now the Republican Party prevails. Anti-slavery forces are outvoted pro-slavery forces, and now in 1857, Kansas is considered a free state. So anti-slavery outvotes pro-slavery in 1857, and here we go. That's where that free soil government comes into play. Right when it comes into play, all those anti-slavery forces, they say, okay guys, we've met our statehood requirements. We want to enter as a free state, and that is what happens. That free soil government pushes forward that application to statehood, and they are entered into the Union as a free state. So for the first 3 years, they're pro-slavery, they're fighting, but in the end, the anti-slavery wins. Something I want to touch on here in Congress, right? Because this was taking place across in Washington, D.C., in Congress, and in Kansas. You have a large separation of land there, but it's really, really important what's going on in Kansas and how it's really affecting, because you have to remember, anti-slavery Northerners and pro-slavery and pro-slavery Southern Democrats are fighting in Kansas. And Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, he criticizes pro-slavery forces and insulted Kansas Nebraska co-author, a guy who co-authored it with Stephen Douglas, from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. And a member of the House of Representatives from South Carolina, a guy named Preston Brooks, goes up to him with a big cane and he starts beating Senator Sumner unconscious on the Congress floor. Think about if our congressmen started doing that today, right? Think about if Mitch McConnell just started punching people across the aisle. It's crazy. This is what was happening in the United States because of what was going on in Kansas. So this was called Bleeding Kansas, right? Sack of Lawrence. That's what's going on here. The Sack of Lawrence, burning buildings. This guy right here, John Brown. What's his response? Who is John Brown? John Brown was a fierce abolitionist. He was from Massachusetts. He was very Christian. He had 20 kids. And when he heard about what was going on in Lawrence, he says, I'm going to take this into my own hands and I'm going to make something of it. So John Brown takes his whole family and moves out to Kansas, and he says, I am going to take care of this on my own. So in May 1856, what John Brown does, he and a couple of his sons, about 6 of his sons, enter Potawatomi Creek, which is a little town which has pro-slavery forces living in there. Remember, he's a fierce abolitionist. I'm taking it into my own hands. What he thinks is like an eye for an eye. So here's what he says. Hey, you guys, you really sacked Lawrence and burned down those buildings. I'm drawing blood. So he and his sons, armed with guns, knives, long swords, sneak into this village at night. They knock on the door of these 5 pro-slavery men, and what they do is they drag them out. It was one guy, his son, another guy, and they're doing it right in front of their families. What they do is they take these broadswords, which are long, really heavy swords, and they literally hack these guys to death. And this is called the Potawatomi Creek Massacre. So now, this is why Bleeding Kansas. John Brown is really starting this anti-slavery versus pro-slavery battles. You also have the Battle of Blackjack. What happens here is 2 of John Brown's sons are captured. They're being held by a local militia. John Brown and his other anti-slavery forces sneak up on these militiamen at night. They attack them. The battle wages for some time. Finally, John Brown has this militia surrender. So you're now having these skirmishes. The Battle of Blackjack is what you would say is really the first named battle of the Civil War. Now remember, this official Civil War doesn't start till 1860. But you have pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces fighting each other to the death over slavery. This is why you can say that Bleeding Kansas erupts. Kansas, it's a Kansas Civil War right now. Kansas is fighting each other. They're fighting pro-slavery, anti-slavery within the state. John Brown takes it national when he moves away, but you really have this blood now. Remember, the pro-slavery forces only burnt down buildings in Lawrence. They didn't kill anybody, but John Brown is killing people. So what does John Brown do? John Brown makes his way. He's running away now. And you have to remember, John Brown, is he a martyr? Right? Because he will die. Does he die for the cause of slavery? Or is he a terrorist? Is he a hero? Or is he somebody who should be feared? John Brown and their sons make their way back to the east. And what their first plan is they're going to instigate a major slave rebellion. And here's what they do. They're like, hey, we're going to invade Harper's Ferry, Virginia. What Harper's Ferry is, it's an arsenal for the U.S. Army. It holds guns, it holds cannons, and things like that. There's some military, some army stationed there, but not very many. On October 16th, 1859, John Brown, a couple of his sons, 18 men, storm Harper's Ferry, Virginia. They take it over pretty easy, as a matter of fact. They start stealing all these arms, and he starts sending people out. Hey, go tell these slaves, we're going to give these slaves these guns. They're going to rise up against their slave owners, and we're going to travel south, and we're going to free all the slaves, because he's a fierce abolitionist. We're going to give them guns, and we're going to create this major wave of anti-slavery force, and it's going to rid the United States of slavery. Give those arms. Instigate that slave rebellion. Unfortunately for John Brown, he had no backup plan. His plan failed miserably. No slaves came, or very little slaves came, to join this major slave rebellion. He's trapped inside Harper's Ferry. He winds up getting captured with two of his sons, and he's actually captured by Robert E. Lee, who happens to be the Confederate general during the Civil War. John Brown was convicted of treason, murder, conspiracy, and it was immediately put to death by hanging. Northerners criticized Brown's methods. Like I said, is he a terrorist? Is he going around just killing people? But he was very abolitionist, anti-slavery, so they mourned his death. Southerners, they felt threatened by John Brown. My gosh, this guy's going around and killing people now with broadswords. Whack, whack. So, Bleeding Kansas and John Brown go together in this instance right here. The sack of Lawrence, John Brown, the Pottawatomie Creek massacre, the raid on Harper's Ferry. Now we are getting into war here.